Agrarian Studies and Action Aid India. My name is Masego Mazom. I'm the CEO of the Southern Africa Trust and also a board member for the Sam Moyo Institute of Agrarian Studies that is based in Zimbabwe. I think you'll all agree with me that the series, which is a lively and a live demonstration of what South-South networks look like and what South-South collaboration might look like around common issues that preoccupy our times in these odd COVID times, you would agree with me that a seminar series that really focuses on agrarian questions of the global South is a pertinent one, particularly as we have seen widespread hunger all over the world following a number of the restrictions that were introduced as part of the COVID responses by various governments from different corners of the world. It is quite instructive when we bring together scholars and practitioners and thinkers and actors in civil society to reflect on our contemporary times and also to help frame what the different futures might look like. And in today's webinar, we're doing things a little bit differently. We have a two-part program today. The first being a launch of a book, Rethinking Social Sciences with Sam Moyo, which is co-edited by Praveen Jha, Paris Yeres, and Walter Chambati. And our esteemed colleagues are going to tell us a little bit more about that book that we'll be launching today. Following the launch of the book, we will listen to our keynote speaker of the day, who is Walter. Give me a second. Walter Chambati, who's going to be speaking to us about revisiting the land agrarian questions in Africa. But first I'm going to hand over to Paris and to Yaris for us to launch the Rethinking Social Sciences with Sam Moyo and have a discussion on what that book entails, and most importantly, where those who are interested in the book might be able to get it. Over to you, Praveen. You are on mute.
So do we start with the display of the book or that comes? Okay.
Yes, please.
Right.
Please show us the book.
Yes.
The mysterious book. Thank you. There you have it, colleagues. Beautiful cover with a picture of our friend,
Yes.
Sam Moyo. And as always, we wish he continues to rest in peace. And his legacy lives on in these spaces through friends and networks, and also through taking forward some of his brilliant ideas and re-engaging with them. Praveen, over to you.
Thank you very much, Masego, and welcome all the colleagues, friends. This is indeed a very special occasion, an occasion when we pay our tribute to Brother Sam, his legacy, a remarkable life, and it is, of course, also a very somber occasion because we continue to struggle with the pain and loss of his untimely departure in a cruel accident in Delhi almost 4 years ago. How we wish this celebratory occasion could have been pushed long into the future with Sam still around. Alas, that was not to be. Nonetheless, in spirit, he is with us, and let's celebrate that togetherness. A couple of brief remarks before Paris tells you about the book. This book puts together a number of contributions which were published in a special issue of the journal that Sam founded. He was the founder editor-in-chief of the journal called Agrarian South. And soon after his departure, we invited a few colleagues to share their thoughts. So some of those pieces, and then a conference that we had done in Delhi, where there was a fantastic participation from across the world. 5 continents were represented through their eminent scholars. And this book brings together these contributions through the journal and the conference. Let me also share with you that almost everyone who was invited to contribute to the book immediately agreed. Unfortunately, because of certain deadlines relating to publication, etc., we could not include everyone. But this again is almost a global kind of partnership in celebrating Sam. As I said, 5 continents, and on a whole range of areas that Sam worked on. Most of you would know that Sam was indeed a seminal thinker, truly an organic intellectual, deeply rooted in a non-Eurocentric perspective, a third worldist in terms of his vision, truly a South-South kind of partnership, which was at his heart in all his work and so on. And not only through his research, but very creative partnerships that he forged. He possibly was one of the most unique figures in the world in the last roughly 30 odd years or so in promoting that kind of South-South partnership through very dynamic research collaborations. And as I said, deeply embedded in the epistemic sovereignty of the South. His own research interests spanned a very wide range, as I mentioned: land questions, agrarian questions, national questions, social movements, ecology, sustainability, alternative policy regimes, you name it. Fundamentally, all this tied up in his quest for what we can describe as a political economy vision of progressive transformations rooted in justice and sustainability from the perspective of the South. So that is what really bound his work together, cemented his quest together in different areas and so on. Contributors to this book have, in our assessment, done justice to Sam in engaging in a very rich and very substantive manner in a dialogue along almost all these research interests and quests that I mentioned in the foregoing. With that, let me pass on the baton to Brother Paris to talk a little more about the book. Paris, the floor is yours. And thank you, Mesego.
Thank you, Pravin.
Thank you. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Thank you for being here with us today. We are launching this this wonderful little book that we have a present for Sam, for which I'm sure he's very proud of us to have brought to fruition after several years. Pravin has captured very well the essence of this project and Sam's contribution. I will only expand a bit on some of the aspects of this book that could be highlighted. First of all, this is, as noted, this is a tricontinental initiative. In fact, it's more than 3 continents. It's 5 continents that came on board. It's been published by Tópico this year, in the beginning of this year. Tópico Books in New Delhi, who are with us today here on this conversation. And it is distributed by Columbia University Press in a good part of the rest of the world, from what I have understood. There is a special discount rate for this occasion, which will last for a month, a 20% discount using a code CUP20 when ordering from Columbia University Press. This is for this occasion and also in celebration of Tulika's 25th year anniversary. So the book has three sections. One is on the epistemic vision and contributions of Sam Moyle. Some of his closest colleagues have written for this section. Rosie Chicata, who should be joining us soon. William Mo, I see here, who's already with us. Gladys Lacini from Argentina. Lino Some, Ian Scoons, Kojanor from Ghana, Tendai Marisa, some of his closest associates and scholars with whom he had close dialogues over time. The second section is on land agrarian labor questions. And then we have Prabhat Patnaik, Erdem Banerjee, Archana Prasad, who's with us, Smita Gupta, Sandeep Chatra, who's also with us here, and Anamitra Roy Chaudhary. Then there's a final section entitled Unfinished Dialogues on Revolution and Liberation, where we have Samir Amin, Isa Shivji, Utsa Patnaik, Professor Chandra Sekar and Jayati Ghosh, and our colleagues in China, Erebus Wang, Wente Jun Sitsui, who is with us today, and Lau Kinchi, Dinesh Abrol from India, and Yoichi Mine from Japan. So it's a really robust lineup for this book. Everyone did their best to put this together. And it is beyond a tribute to an engagement on with the challenges that the social sciences face today. So it's not only a tribute to Sam, but also a real engagement with some of the main issues that the social sciences and challenges of the social sciences face today. We knew, those who worked with Sam closely knew that his contribution, work of art over many years, larger than the sum of its parts. So he worked on various fronts, which for those who knew him best and worked with him closest, knew that it formed a larger part of a project, which was in essence the indigenization of the social sciences, consistent with the struggles for national liberation and continental and regional liberation. This is really the project that Sam represented. He had many collaborators over time, and this marked his whole life, how to transform the social sciences into an instrument of national liberation. He was heir to the Pan-Africanist tradition. He was a contributor and main participant in the Pan-Africanist tradition of political economy, whose task it was to rethink African and world history on Africa's own terms. So he was heir to that tradition. Mm-hmm. He received his training in the 1970s, his intellectual formation, his intellectual baptism of fire, as we call it, in the 1970s in West Africa, after he had left colonial Zimbabwe, where he interacted with luminaries such as Sheikh Anta Diop, Samir Amin, and many others who at that time were setting up the Council for the Development of the Social Sciences Research in Africa, CODESTRIA, like Abdallah Boujra, later Tandika Makandawire, Zentades, Archimafe, the whole Mahmoud Mamdani, and many others. Sam straddled two generations. He was heir to this Pan-Africanist tradition, but he also was part of the second generation of Pan-Africanist scholars who were committed to training in the continent the subsequent generations that were coming and growing at the time. He was a figure between these two generations. This tradition of political economy grew in conflict first with the Eurocentric political economy that was very present to this day, in fact, on the continent. Marxist political economy with a Eurocentric vocation. So the Pan-Africanist tradition grew, set as its object the overcoming of this Eurocentrism. But in the 80s, 90s, then this whole tradition evolved further in conflict with neoliberalism and the culturalist turn of especially the 90s. So the Pan-Africanist tradition of political economy evolved, and Sam was a key player in all of this. He was an institution builder on the continent, in Zimbabwe, and in the South. So Codestria was always a source of strength. That's where he sought refuge against intellectual isolation. He became vice president, and then president of Codestria. In the 2000s, he became president. He also built institutions or contributed to the building of institutions in Zimbabwe, the Zimbabwe Institute of Development Studies in the 80s, the Zimbabwe Environmental Regional Organization and in the 90s, and SARIPS, the Southern Africa Research Institute for Policy Studies. And finally, he founded the African Institute for Agrarian Studies in 2002. From then on, he also launched the South-South initiatives. First, he was a very important figure in the South-South collaboration of Codestria and Claxo, together with Gladys Licini, who contributed to this volume. He participated in the Third World Forum, the World Forum for Alternatives, and finally, he spearheaded the formation of the Agrarian South Network and this journal. Just briefly, his intellectual formation, he had a holistic vision of the social sciences. This was the heritage of the 1970s in the Pan-African tradition. At the center of gravity of his concerns were the land and agrarian questions in Africa. Given that the large majority of the population was, and the majority continues to be, rural-based in Africa. His lineage, his intellectual lineages, more specifically, as he himself acknowledged, were Mafeje, Archie Mafeje, primarily, as well as Amin, and several others who remained close to him until his passing, like Isa Shivji and others, Zodi Tsikata, and a number of others. On Zimbabwe, he was devoted to the land question and land reform, which he defended rigorously through hard-nosed research throughout the 2000s. And in the context of Africa, he took Mafeje's analysis further to show that, first of all, the difference between settler and non-settler Africa remained important. However, even non-settler Africa was experiencing land alienation and land concentration. This was an important statement in the 2000s, which he made in Codestria, and before the land grab literature came on board. So on the South front, he built slowly a network through the publication of books, which eventually came to be the so-called Reclaiming Trilogy. First, it was Reclaiming the Land, then Reclaiming the Nation, and then Reclaiming Africa, which was published posthumously. Finally, what emerges from Sam's the emerging principles of what we call epistemic sovereignty. First of all, for Sam, there was no distinction between an organic local intellectual and a universalist intellectual, as has often been presented as a clear as a sharp distinction. Sam did not believe in this and did not represent this such a dichotomy. Also, he did not believe that there was a distinction between political economy and analysis of representation or discourse analysis. He was fully capable of unmasking white supremacism, the ideology which sustained an economic system in Zimbabwe. He also believed that epistemic sovereignty was much more than academic freedom or epistemic freedom. He focused. He was very concerned about the material conditions of knowledge production. He was concerned with the establishment of autonomous and viable scientific infrastructure, publicly and adequately funded centers of higher learning, and with breaking the monopolies in the publication industry. That was a very important aspect of his thinking about epistemic sovereignty. There was a material context which needed to be overcome. The other aspect was the ideological struggle for indigenizing the social sciences. And for this, he believed that there had to be an organic relationship, working close to the ground, especially in the rural areas. He was always a critic of urban-biased social science. He believed that social science had to have an anchor in the material realities of the modern world. He believed that it was necessary to recognize collective authorship of the Pan-Africanist tradition against various strategies of appropriation. He believed that developing ideas was a task that needed to be done collectively via concrete networks such as Codestria and Agrarian South. In an interview he gave in China, also published posthumously, he has a statement. He says the network is also the method. So these networks for him were a way of developing ideas in a collective fashion. He did not believe in individual scholarship. And he also believed that particularity and universality could only be attained through collaborative work, through comparative work on a South-South basis, which also was the basis of the South-South solidarity which he spearheaded. Sam's rare feat, finally, was to establish the conditions for a trichotomy whose center of gravity also remained in Africa. Today, we can find numerous initiatives, but his point, but they're not always based. The center of gravity is not necessarily Africa. It's actually not so. So Sam was very clear about that. Then we can, to cap it all off, his greater feat even was to put all this into motion without making personal enemies. Sam was loved by everyone all over the world, whatever the politics were. He was uniquely capable of crossing the political divide and making friends everywhere. One might recall, as we mentioned in the book, Engels's eulogy to Marx at Marx's graveside, where he said, "I make bold to say that though he may have had many opponents, he had hardly one personal enemy." And that certainly applies to Brother Sam.
Paris, thank you so much. And you know, I didn't think that it was going to be possible for you to actually sum up the summary of the book, but also in that context as well, just give testimony to a life of somebody as great as our, colleague, comrade, brother, friend, Professor Sam Moyo. And both you and Pravin have been able to say so much in the 20 minutes. I think what really stood out for me, which stands true of who and what Sam was is the three things that you said, you know, the kind of importance and emphasis that he put on ideation, and the importance of creating spaces for ideas and for thinking, for writing, and for political economy analysis to, one, come from the continent, but in the same breath, the second thing that you said, building solidarity and networks, the South-South networks, and networks that even go beyond this dichotomy we talk about when we talk about the South-South networks. He also didn't shy away from having a public voice and being very clear with clarity of thought on where he stood on issues based on his own assessments, no matter how politically hot the situation was. And I recall here some of his public utterings on the reform process in Zimbabwe. And I often wonder what he would make of the conversations that we're having at the moment about the compensation that the government of Zimbabwe has recently signed off for the 4,000 individual white farmers who lost land under the land reform process in Zimbabwe. There's just so many questions that remain. And in this moment, when we are thinking about how to meet the question of providing food and addressing world hunger in the midst of one of the greatest pandemics to face humanity, I think Sam would encourage us to go beyond just the current moment, to look at a historical analysis and continue those conversations around who owns the means of production. What is the redistribution agenda? What is it that makes our system so fragile that 3 months into a lockdown, people may be struggling to feed themselves? He definitely not only shared bright ideas, he did leave a legacy in the form of the institutions that you also spoke about, Codestria, and also the Sam Moyo Institute of Agrarian Studies, that kept going at a time when there were very few places that were insisting on using the political economy as a lens to understanding the agrarian question, when it was even considered to be old-fashioned. So it is not accidental. I actually think it is such a great honor that today we have with us Walter, who will be as a keynote speaker, because Walter is, again, a living legacy of Sam's contribution, somebody who worked closely under the mentorship of Professor Sam Moyo and continues to hold his own and take us in directions that encourage us to think about both old and new questions around agrarian reform in the continent. But before I introduce the next session, I see that Pravin would like to make a comment briefly. Pravin.
Yes, Masego, just a request. Before Walter starts, let us display the book again for those who joined us late.
Absolutely. I don't have a book to display, but I will.
We are sorry that you don't have a copy, but you will get a copy soon. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. And congratulations to all who were involved in publishing that book. And I'm also glad to see that both the authors and the publishers did think about making the book accessible to everyone. So try and get a copy while that discount is still running. At the end of the talk, we will repeat the code so that you know what code to put in so that you can qualify for the discount. But yes, please get yourselves a copy. I can assure you, you will not be disappointed in just the depth of the issues that are covered and just the relevance of it in today's times. So with that, I would like to move on to the next session. And as I was saying, it is just really befitting that we've got with us Dr. Walter Chambati as the keynote speaker. And the title of his talk today is Revisiting the Land and Agrarian Questions in Africa. Director of the Sam Moyo African Institute for Agrarian Studies, based in Harare, Zimbabwe. Editor of the Agrarian South, Journal of Political Economy. He has published extensively on land, labor, and agrarian relations in Zimbabwe and Southern Africa. Walter is also a co-editor, as you heard earlier, of the Rethinking Social Sciences with Sam Moyo, which was published this year. And he's also a co-editor of the forthcoming Labor Questions in the Global South, which is going to be published by Springer. We're also looking forward to that. Prolific author, he's also an editor of Farming and Working Under Contract, Peasants and Workers in the Global Agricultural Value Chains, Tulika Books. And with Walter, we will also hear from Professor Achana Prasad, who is going to be the discussant. She is from the Center for Informal Sector and Labor Studies. Professor Achard works at the Center of Informal and Labor Studies at the Jawaharlal Nehru University in New Delhi. She's the author of Against Ecological Romanticism, Varia Elwin and Making of an Anti-Modern Tribal Identity, and the Environmentalism and the Left, Contemporary Debates and Futures Agenda. She's a scholar activist of note. I think the profile of her that I read doesn't do much justice to what it is that she does. Please, ladies.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. Yeah.
Thank you, Madam Chair. It is befitting that the title of my presentation today is titled Revisiting Linear Agrarian Questions in Africa. It was at the core, at the heart of Professor Sam Moyo's scholarship over a long period of time. May his ideas live long and continue to inspire our struggles for the emancipation of the working people across the South. So I've structured my presentation in four broad categories. After the introduction, I'll briefly discuss the differentiated African land questions. Then I'll move on to highlight some of the challenges related to agrarian transformation in the continent. Then thirdly, I'll look at some of the policy responses that we've seen in response to the crisis under this neoliberal order that we are seeing on the continent, and try to respond to some of the challenges that are being faced in the rural area. Then lastly, I'll conclude with a call for progressive agrarian reforms, which put the peasantry at the center of the transformation of the countryside in Africa, and also takes into account gender equity and ecological imperatives for wider sustainability of our countrysides. Yeah. So over the last 6 or 7 decades, after the end of colonization, the continent has failed to make the transition from farm to factory. In fact, the dominant trend which is being witnessed across many parts of the South is that of deindustrialization, industries closing down, going under. So it is no surprise that access to land remains key for the majority of the continent's populace who still inhabit in the rural areas, whom we may call peasants, farming on small plots of land on customary lands, primarily using family labor to work the land to produce food and surplus for sale in the domestic and international markets for the few that are integrated into the various world markets for in the agricultural sector. Yeah. So because agriculture has been bedeviled by a multiplex of crises, most of the peasantry today do not survive on agriculture alone, but live by combining a whole range of livelihood strategies, which Moyo and Eros have categorized as a generalized condition of semi-culturalization, combining a different range of livelihood activities, farming and other non-farm activities, which sometimes involves straddling across town and country in order to eke out a survival because of the agrarian conditions that are not suitable for them to reproduce themselves and their families. Yeah. So African peasants, as we have heard in the introduction by the chair, are facing a crisis of reproduction. Outside of Asia, Africa is home to the largest population of food insecure, undernourished, malnourished. Poverty is largely a rural phenomenon, also gendered, with the majority of women being afflicted by poverty across the different regions of the subcontinent. Of course, the conditions are differentiated across the different regions, East, Southern, and Northern Africa. The Horn and the southern parts are mostly affected by these problems of hunger and malnutrition. Yeah. So Africa, if we go back to Mafeje, Africa is still to resolve the basic agrarian question of improving productivity. Productivity remains low across many parts of the regions. Yeah, it's unable to supply adequate industrial, adequate wage goods and raw materials to feed into the rudimentary industry that exists across most parts of the continent. So the promoting accumulation from below has been a major challenge for many countries in the region. Yeah. So this transition, this failed agrarian transition, is primarily framed as a question of backwardness, a technological backwardness of the peasantry that impedes that transition from a more productive kind of agriculture, land tenure deficiencies, and so forth, and, as well as ecological imperatives. Yeah, but this kind of framing tends to neglect the effects of land alienation dating back to the colonial era and the inequalities which have evolved over a long period of time on the basis of accumulation from above and accumulation from below. I'll speak more of that, as well as the unequal trade relations are not spoken about in terms of trying to construct some of the challenges that the countryside in Africa faces, the unequal trade relations between Africa and the imperialist centers, and also absence of positive interventions into the agrarian sector, the kinds of which we see in the US, in the EU, in the form of subsidies, huge subsidies. I recall Professor Jao talked about the subsidies of a dairy cow is much more than the support that human beings in the South receive. So you have that unequal platform in terms of the farming community across the different parts of the South. Yeah? As you are all aware, Africa, the land challenges, the land and agrarian challenges in Africa can be traced to the various modes of colonization which have been articulated by Semai Amin, the varied modes of colonization in the South. It was largely a type of settler colonization which dispossessed the peasantry and pushed them onto the margins, as opposed to the peasant economies in the West, where exploitation of the indigenes was largely through their participation and integration into the markets. Then you also have the Africa of the plantations or the enclaves, which were characterized by looting and plunder of natural resources. If you look at the DRC and other jurisdiction for an example. Yeah. So the food situation in Africa has evolved over the last 30 years. If you look at the 1970s, most of the African countries were net food exporters. But 4 decades later, because of various policy changes, largely led by structural adjustment, most of the countries now are net net food importers. There's high food import dependency amongst many of the African countries. They rely on importing food to meet the demands for the home market. So structural adjustment forced on African governments caused a shift from food self-sufficiency to more or less a food security concept, where African governments were told to focus on a product that they have a competitive advantage and then keep forex reserves in order to meet their requirements for food from different parts of the globe. Yeah, so structural adjustment has set back Africa in terms of its capacity to produce adequate food to support its growing populace. Since structural adjustment, the policy space for African governments to chart an autonomous development path has been shrinking. Most of our states today take cue from the Bretton Woods institutions and bilateral donors from the north or the west, if you like. Yeah. So these challenges of food have been persisting over the last 20 or so years. And the recent solution that we've seen that has been suggested was that of dispossessing the peasantry of their land to reconstitute large-scale commercial farms in regions which have historically not experienced settler colonization in order to meet the food deficits that the continent is currently facing. So the current reforms basically tend to neglect the social reproduction requirements of the peasantry, if you like, but focus on trying to generate these large-scale commercial farms, ostensibly to recover the food deficits which intensified from the 2008 and so forth, with a variety of actors. I'll speak more of that. So if you look at the continent, we have a variety of land questioning, a variety of land questions, which I classify into 5 or so broad. One is, which I've already mentioned, the settler land expropriation and racial land inequities, which are experienced largely in the south and part of the east in Kenya, in the south, Zimbabwe, South Africa, and Namibia. Then we have inequalities which have been evolving over a long period of time as a result of various processes of accumulation from above and from below. Then you have also ethnic and regional differentiation in land control, which can also be traced to the divide and rule tactics. If you look at the case of Uganda, where various ethnic groups were privileged to own more land at the expense of other. This situation can be found in a variety, in various countries across the ethnic tensions over control of land. Then we also have the control of land and natural resources by foreigners, the concessioning of land to foreigners. So it's also one of the key questions that we face at the current juncture. Then lastly, gender inequalities in land access and insecurity. Yeah. So if you look at the settler question in a nutshell, yeah, as I've said, it entailed the dispossession of the peasantry from their prime lands and being pushed to the margins. In South Africa, as much as 80% of the land was confiscated from the peasantry and converted into freehold land for the white settlers. Namibia up to 50%, Zimbabwe up to 45%. So you have that unequal distribution as a result of dispossession of land which occurred under colonial conquest. Yeah. Then if you look at the inequalities which have been arising as a result of accumulation from above and from below, before I get to that, overall in the continent we're noticing a growing trend of land scarcities. Since the 1950s, there's been a declining per capita farm sizes. Farm sizes have been declining. People are, as a result of population growth, increasingly households are getting access to less and less land as the population grows. The demand for land is also growing in tandem with the population growth. So increasingly we are noticing a growing scarcity of land. Although Africa tends to be portrayed as a continent where there's vast and abundant land. But in reality, if you look closely at the kind of land that we have on the continent, the bulk of it is of a semi-arid type, not suitable for agriculture and so forth. Yeah. So the usable land, there's been growing scarcity for arable land and so forth. Before you even talk about the issue of inequalities in the distribution of land. Yeah. So recent studies have also shown the intricate linkage between access to land and poverty. So poverty, which is largely a rural phenomenon in Africa, is also directly linked in a direct relationship with access to land. Households would command less land are also concerned with those households who are also found within the poor stratums of society. Yeah. So as a result of processes of accumulation from below and from above, there's been a trend of rural differentiation in terms of accumulation of land. These dynamics play out differently across different countries. In some parts, you have traditional leaders who are largely considered to be the custodians of customary land, accumulating, amassing land together with their friends and relatives. So there's differentiation in the land sizes that are owned by the different households. There's no homogeneity in terms of the land sizes that you come across within the countryside. So this process of accumulation from below as well as from above, our states, most states from the 1970s have been promoting this phenomenon called middle farm, promoting a type of commercial farming largely benefiting elites, and some of that land has been taken away from the peasantry. If you look at Malawi and Zimbabwe, and also such kind of programs to promote middle farms, Zambia and so forth. So there's this tendency of the middle farm, which has been parceling out land to urban elite civil servants. So we're noticing this growing trend of rural differentiation as a result of processes of accumulation from above and from below. So a process of the inequalities have been growing across many countries: Kenya, Malawi, Ivory Coast, Mozambique, Ghana, Nigeria, and Zambia. If you want to look, if I give you an example here, in Kenya, 20% of the population now own over 50% of the arable land, while the rest own an average of 1 acre. Yeah. So landlessness has also been on the rise as a result of a few sections of society accumulating land together with clan-based, class-based elites and so forth. Yeah. But then the third dimension, which we could also speak about, relates to the issue of foreign land ownership, parceling of land to foreigners for mining. This has been a major problem across both in the southern parts, Western Africa. Yeah, land has been concessioned, mostly land belonging to peasants being concessioned as mining concessions, depriving the peasantry of much needed land to reproduce themselves and their households. Then the fourth problem, which we can look at, relates to the outward focus of our land use policies and the discriminatory land use regulations. Yeah. So alongside structural adjustments, most of our African governments were urged to adopt export-led growth, including in agriculture. So development policies, including macroeconomic incentives, have been focused towards promoting exports, produce for exports, rather than producing adequate food for the home market. If I give you an example of my own country, Zimbabwe, up to 65% of the credit that comes through the private sector is channeled towards export crops such as tobacco. So there's this imbalance in terms of prioritization of food for the home market and export. Most of the policies are geared towards boosting export production to earn foreign currency and so forth. And in the agricultural sector, large farms tend to be considered as critical for the development of exports. And small farms tend to be relegated to focus on production for consumption in domestic markets with little support from the states. So low productivity characterize crops which are crops and livestock which are produced by the peasantry. So this export focus, this focus on exports has led to this commercialization of agriculture, has led to increased pressure for land as various stratums of society wish to enter the various lucrative export production. Yeah, and informal land markets have been on the rise, and women have been under pressure to vulnerable for sale to the emerging capitalist farmers who are wanting to enter these so-called export chains. Yeah. So with increased commodity production and growing individualization, and particular application of customary tenure rules have withered away women's tenure security as people struggle to gain a foothold in this so-called export chain. Then the fifth problem we could look at relates to discriminatory customary tenure systems, yeah, and land markets. As you will recall, most of our governments inherited these dual land tenure systems in which customary tenure was considered as inferior to freehold title. Most of the customary lands, the radical title is held by the state, which has power to confiscate land in the interest of the public. Most of our constitutions across the continent have got this. The state is empowered to confiscate land in the interest of the public interest. They say the lawyers will educate us more on the issue of public interest. So contrary to indigenous tradition, most of Africans living under customary tenure systems have tended to occupy lands by permission of the state, which is the ultimate owner or holder of the radical title. So we've witnessed across many parts of the continent how the state has used this power to dispossess and push the peasantry to facilitate the entry of various types of domestic or foreign capital. Forced removals of people are common across to institute various types of activities, including mining, large-scale agriculture, and so forth. So this insecure form of tenure that many of the peasantry still live under today restricts their secure access to land in order to reproduce themselves. So in summary, state land expropriation is a main source of land tenure insecurity in the interest in the public interest. Yeah. So what we're calling for is a land tenure security that should guarantee a secure place to live from threat of eviction with access to productive and natural resources. Most of our peasants today lack that kind of provision as a result of the X that keeps on hanging on them from the state. So the state is the main source of threat to the secure access for those holding land in the customary areas. Then sixthly, the issue of gender inequalities in land access and tenure insecurity. Women's access to land and control, women's access to and control of land is inadequate and constrained by various customary practices which privilege men as the farmers in the context of the patriarchal social relations which permeates most of our countrysides in the continent. Yeah. So within the household, women provide labor under severely exploitative relations of production. Clan and family patriarchs control the means of production. Male heads are the dominant actors in determining the use of land and the rewards that come from the land to the detriment of women. So the rewards are inequitable across the different members of the households within the countryside. Yeah. So the COVID-19 pandemic is magnified the crisis related to the land questions in Africa today. You recall at the beginning, I said most of the peasantry today are unable to survive on the basis of agriculture alone because of the conditions do not support adequate social reproduction for them and their families. So with the pandemic coming in to the fore, it has disrupted the various livelihood paths. The semi-protracted strategies has been severely curtailed as it entails moving from one place to the other to eke out a living. So the lockdowns have curtailed other avenues which contribute to the reproduction of rural households. Although we know that deindustrialization has been underway for some time, for the last 2-3 decades, the pandemic has decimated a sizable number of vulnerable jobs in the informal sector, most of which remain shut as we speak. And some of those jobs are not going to come back that have been shut by the pandemic. Yeah, so what we've seen with the pandemic, we've seen flows of people. As always, when urban livelihoods become constrained, land becomes the fallback position. So we've seen people returning back to the countryside with implications on the struggles, for land. Yeah. And women are at risk of being pushed further to the margins. Some of the male counterparts return to the countryside to try to eke out a living. So on top of the existing challenges in the land sector that the continent has been facing, the pandemic has exacerbated the demand for land as urban livelihoods have become constricted and restricted as a result of the decimation of jobs in the urban areas as a result of the various lockdowns implemented by governments across the countries. Yeah. So moving on to the next section, try to illustrate to briefly discuss some of the challenges that relate to the transformation of agrarian transformation in the continent. Yeah. So one key issue that I'd want to flag out upfront relates to across many of our countries, the development needs of small producers tend to be held on the back burner. They are not prioritized. Yeah, they are considered as subsistence. So the focus is largely on large farms who are considered as the suitable, the capable agents to lead transformation in the country, despite their dependency on subsidized imported inputs and export focus, and also the ecological damage that this high input industrial agricultural type of farming has been causing to the environment. Yeah. So food, as I've said earlier, food import dependency has been on the rise. Most of the countries today depend on food aid. If you look at our region, Southern Africa, there's a variation between 50 to 70% of the food needs of most of the countries is imported to meet the requirements of the home market. Yeah. To that, you also add the climate crisis, which has been picking up over the last 2 decades. Again, I'll draw an example from the Southern African region. Since 2012, we've only had two good rainfall seasons. And on top of that, you add the recent disasters which we experienced in 2019 and in 2019, Cyclone Idai and Cyclone Kenneth, which has added to deflate the agrarian conditions. Because of the import dependency, most of our countries are exposed to high global price fluctuations on the international markets, which then affect the ability of different governments, different states to meet different requirements. Yeah. So most of the policy focus, the agrarian reforms during this period has been focused on enhancing commodity marketing and tenure reforms, some titling of some sort in Rwanda, Tanzania, yeah, try to as a solution to reverse the underinvestment, yeah, in the countryside. But this has largely been to facilitate the appropriation of surpluses for large monopolies who have cornered the market for many of the agricultural products produced on the continent. So there's been a focus of deepening the integration of the peasantry into the world food systems in order to facilitate the appropriation of surpluses by large monopolies. So since social adjustment, the neoliberal policies have reinforced the marginalization of small producers. Most of the intervention that we had in the early years of independence was reversed as a result of structural adjustment. And women have been hardest hit. Yeah. The technological deficits, I will not belabor much. The land and labor productivity levels remain very low, in addition to the climate crisis that I've alluded to before. Yeah. So given this context of a crisis in the agrarian sector, the policy responses we've seen in the 2000s, since the mid-2000s, which picked up after the food price hikes of 2008, has been the dispossession of lands belonging to the peasantry to facilitate the creation of large-scale commercial farms, ostensibly to recover the food deficits. Challenges with ecological damage and exploitative labor relations that tend to be found in those large commercial farms. If you look at the history of Southern Africa tells us of the exploitation of labor that took place over a period of a century to facilitate accumulation of white settler agriculture. So there's been this major drive to create large-scale commercial farms, particularly in countries which didn't experience settler colonization before. Yeah. So I mean, at this point, also advertise our book. We published the book. Paris mentioned it, Reclaiming Africa: Scramble and Resisting the 21st Century, which documents some of these dynamics around land grabbing across different parts of the continent, different case studies. Yeah. So there's been this drive to dispossess the peasant. The peasant are the key means of production are increasingly being dispossessed from the peasantry to create these large-scale agricultural farms, which are considered as the panacea to recover food deficits and bolster agricultural exports. So beyond land grabs, one of the persistent strategies during this crisis has been to increase the integration, incorporation of African peasantries into the world markets through either through contract farming, either through so-called philanthropic activities, such as AGRA, which is closely tied to large monopoly capital through the supply of seeds and so forth. Yeah. So we're witnessing the deepening integration of the peasantry in unequal and exploitative relationships with large monopolies, which control the bulk of the world market. Yeah. So as a result, the majority of the food systems across the continent are facing severe attack, as these programs tend to be focused on a few commodities and erode the diversity of production, and with it, the nutritional benefits which come with the production of a variety of crops. They tend to focus on one crops and restrict practices which bolster nutrition within households, such as mixed cropping and so forth. A recent a damning report on AGRA's success or lack of it over the last 12 years by a coalition of civil society and academics provides a damning account of the impact that Agri has had in the various 13 countries that it operates, including it has failed to meet with promises of improving productivity. It has eroded seed sovereignty of the different small-scale producers that they are working with, the diversity of production, and with it, a rise in malnutrition affected with monocultures, that the type of agriculture that they are promoting. So within this context of crisis, the responses that we've seen, responses to radical responses to land alienation, food crisis, and the demise of the peasantry in Africa that are not donor funded are few and far between. To date, the activism has generally failed. The activism of various social movements on the continent has failed to reverse land dispossession. Yeah, popular responses, particularly resistant to inequitable land grabbing, such as land occupations and other forms of struggle to access resources, are mostly isolated, but these do hold promise if they gain momentum. Quick examples that come to mind is the Zimbabwe land movement, which overturned the monopolization of land held by a few white settlers. Then more recently, a success was in Mozambique. A variety of peasant movements and civil society coalitions managed to block the progression of the pro-Savannah group. And Mali is also another good example to look at how movements have impeded the integration of the peasantry into the world markets. Farmers' movements in Mali have actively campaigned for the recognition of seed sovereignty rights that have now been enshrined in the country's laws, to protect. Most of our countries are witnessing erosion of seed sovereignty through various treaties and so forth, so that they don't conflict with the supply emanating from the large monopolies. So success, there are few and success cases of resistance which go against the type of reforms promoted by the Bretton Woods institutions. Perhaps one could also mention Malawi, although still it remains largely tied to monopoly capital, the widespread input subsidies that they launched over a couple of years, which bolstered production at least, but largely focused on maize, on maize production. To conclude, Madam Chair, I would want to call for an agenda for agrarian reform, which puts the peasantry at the center of the transformation that we should hope for in the countryside. And also takes into account issues of gender equity, rethinking the kind of model of industrial agriculture which damages the ecology and contributes to the climate crisis currently afflicting the continent at this current juncture. So the purpose of this reform after Patnaik 2018 should be to create conditions for a rise in agricultural productivity such that raw materials and wage goods needs of a growing manufacturing sector can be met while labor is released. So how can agriculture contribute to national transformation through diversified industrialization and improved wage employment, although other sectors such as mining will also be expected to contribute. So land reforms should be at the center of these progressive agrarian reforms that I'm calling for. Particularly the equitable distribution of land and secure land, not necessarily as private property, is a precondition for the social reproduction of an actually existing and growing satisfying the home market, which will facilitate the economic diversification, which will also feed into an industrial strategy that we can think of. Yeah, the need for gender equity in these agrarian reforms cannot be emphasized. Women need also to be included in the various reforms, bring back the state to rebuild the productive forces of the small producers. Yeah. So the idea of cooperatives, as Moyo, Jai, and Yoris recently reminded us, are also key to transcend the constraints that the peasantry face in terms of scale and their power in relation to large monopoly capital, which has cornered the world market. Because the pandemic has disrupted the various agri-value systems, agri-value chains, and so forth, I think it's an opportunity for us to rethink, to think of a food sovereignty project in the context of these disruptions, as food is unable to move from one place to the other, primarily due to the lockdowns. There are various constraints to the supply of different foods for countries which are food import dependent. So we need to think of national and regional food, national and regional food sovereignty to bolster the transformation of the countryside. I'll stop there, Madam Chair. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Walter. You did a good job there, really giving us a layout of what the contemporary agrarian question is, you know, for today's topic. And I really do like that you actually started off by giving us a picture of how the agrarian transitions have been stalled over the last 6 decades and the factors that were at play. And looking at different contexts, really starting to speak about the questions that Africa is yet to resolve. And this is really a question around how to go about improving production. The big question is still goes back to how do we improve agricultural production? And I guess for the mere purpose of resolving the twin problem of poverty and hunger. And where you then landed us, again, is a good place that actually gets to show us the tensions that are at play in how people position themselves and institutions are positioning themselves to provide answers that resolve this question. And what you began to talk about, AGRA, which is something that has stepped up as Africa's green revolution and an answer to unlocking answers to the question of how we overcome poverty and inequality. You also gave some really interesting examples of what alternatives are emerging in the form of agroecology movements that are led by scholars and citizens, activists, and NGOs. The No to Pro-Savannah movement, pro-Savannah movement that we see in Mozambique, and also what the land network that you spoke about in Zimbabwe. So you've been able to help us move from the conceptual framing of what the challenges are to understanding how different actors are coming together as groups to provide answers to these very complex questions. I'm also glad that you also began to speak about the gender dimensions, which is often a forgotten topic, and one that is either left to feminists to unpack or those who are looking at the question of gender. But you demonstrated the intersectionality and the nuance in the lens that we must keep in mind as we think through the agrarian question. I think this is then a good point at which I should introduce our discussant, Professor Archana Prasad from the Center of Informal Sector and Labor Studies. She's a pioneering sociologist and anthropologist, as I said in my introduction, and she works in the areas of ecology. She also looks at questions of identity, tribal identity and modern identity, and environmentalisms and the left, as indicated by her various publications. Professor Achana, over to you. She is our main discussant this afternoon.
Thank you, Masigu, and thank you, Walter, for that very interesting and important intervention that you made in your keynote speech. But before I sort of get on to discussing some of the themes that have come out of your intervention, I'd like to just make two small comments. The first thing that I'd like to say is that today, when we study the contemporary agrarian question, we study it in the context of not only the growing concentration of wealth, but also the growing political power and repression that is going on. That is in the context of the rise of fascism within and fascistic forces throughout the world, in the north and the south. And you yourself in Zimbabwe are experiencing the way in which dissent is being repressed. We have seen in the case of, for example, the famous cases of Hopewell, the targeting of Beatrice, all those issues. So I'd first like to start with expressing my solidarity with the struggles that people in Africa are undergoing, and also the struggles, the tricontinental struggles in the South, where we are increasingly getting organized for our democratic rights, but we are also increasingly facing challenges where peasants, workers, urban poor, and other kinds of classes and minorities, all kinds of people are facing really great repression because of the turns within capitalism, not only materially, but also politically and socially. The counter-revolutions that are taking place, the entire setback to the democratic women's movements that are taking place by rise of conservatism, the sort of overplaying of cultural identities that is taking place, not to basically make societies more egalitarian, but to make them more competitive through the intervention of capital itself. So I would like to distinguish between the resistance that is taking place in democratic resistance that is taking place and all kinds of other tendencies that are being unleashed through the intervention of capital and capitalists in almost all spheres of life, the deepening penetration. And I'd like to place the agrarian question within that context within that context. Having said that, I'd like to first sort of make a few remarks about the overall framework and the questions that Walter posed. The main question that he started with is why the transition has not taken place. I would like to pose a counter question to that in a world, and he also actually gave the answer to it in the same manner, so I'm not really arguing with Walter. I'm only taking off from the understanding of our understanding in the Agrarian South Network and really taking off from the work of Sam and other sort of very, very, I would not say organic, but grounded intellectuals who practiced praxis, which is the dialectical relationship between theory and practice, which I think Sam was really a model off. So my counter question to that would be, should we expect the transition to take place in a world which is basically ridden with uneven development? It's not only that the society is ridden with uneven development, but the world per se is ridden with uneven development. And even if you have some form of peripheral capitalisms coming up, the concentration and the accumulation remains very much focused on the powers of the North. Yeah. So having said that, I'd then like to tie it up with the distinction that actually Walter made between accumulation from below and accumulation from above. I was wondering whether this distinction is basically just a heuristic or a theoretical distinction, which sort of I mean, these are not independent processes, as you yourself indicated. These are not independent processes. I mean, the allies that capital makes, the way in which it adapts not only to local communitarian and class structures and local patriarchies, but the way it molds these local patriarchies and race equations and even deepens the local inequities is something that I'd really like to ask Walter to focus a little bit more about, because that will then get us onto a much more interesting understanding of the interface between the changing forms of patriarchy, the changing articulations of race relations, and the overall relationship with the way in which classes are formed and differentiation takes place within this larger project of uneven development. So if we look at it, I mean, some of these questions are actually quite common for the South as a whole. They are not questions that may be specific to Zimbabwe or specific to some areas of Africa, though their articulation, their regional articulations may be different because their local settings, their local regimes, power equations, and production systems are different from each other. They are different from each other. So when we talk about the contemporary, and you see, while I'm speaking about this, I was having a look, once again, having a look at the book that we made for Sam, which Walter, Praveen, and Paris edited. And you see, some of these questions are quite pregnant in that book. Because if you look at Sam's own work, and I've recently been reading his early work also, the questions of ecology and equity in all its societal and economic forms is very, very, I mean, these are the challenges, the theoretical challenges that actually Sam throws to us also. That how do we carry this forward? And what are the ways of looking at the challenges that take place? And therefore, I'd like, I mean, if there's a chance for a response, I'd like Walter to actually expand on the way in which capitalism penetrates into the local society, and what kind of articulations or disarticulations take place. I've read some of Walter's work on land reforms, and some of that is quite, in fact, interesting and it would be nice if it would come to the fore. Another point that I'd really like to raise is that, and I know that Walter is quite familiar with this point also, and people have been writing about it also, even in the reclaiming volume and in the rethinking volume, both the volumes. That theme was very sort of prevalent, is the question of the financialization of agriculture itself. And I think some of the most interesting work which Walter and Sam did together in Zimbabwe actually shows you how the contract and the finance actually brings up a new stage of capitalism within agriculture itself. So that is something that I wanted to bring up, which was implied in actually Walter's presentation, but which I don't think he had the time to really fully talk about, because that is the form that is hitting us now. It's hitting us now that in the tribal area in which I work, a company does not need to own the land anymore, but it can control the land. The fact that it does not own the land and can control the land, now that itself has an implication for the gender division of labor. It itself has an implication for the ethnic concentrations and divisions that are taking place within land relations itself. So this is something that I'd like also some more insight from Africa. I mean, one could talk a little more about India, but that would really just throw the discussion off, and there's not that much time also. So that is another issue that I would like to raise right now. The third thing is about social reproduction. I think that we really, in the context of what I've said, I think that we really need to reconceptualize or widen the scope of what we know as social reproduction. Because social reproduction is not only a material process, according to me, it's also an ideological process. And that ideological process is not merely in terms of stereotype roles, but the way in which community institutions and families get embedded in new relations of capital and labor. And the kind of norms and the morality that they sort of, what should I say, the norms and the morality that they follow or transform or even reinforce in order to support what Walter, in fact, called the accumulation from below. But I would say that in order to support the different nodes of accumulation in the larger accumulation process. Yeah. So if we look at social reproduction in that way, then I think that the agrarian question with respect to social reproduction is not only focused on land. It's true, land is really very important because of the different forms of semi-proletarianization that are taking place that we very well know from the work of the scholars associated with the Agrarian South Network and the way in which they have intervened in the contemporary agrarian debates. But I think that that issue needs to be pushed by us a little bit more. Because if we push it a little bit more, then that means that we are also breaking new ground in the way in which we look at the agrarian question itself. Then we don't look at the gender question as a separate question. We don't look at the race question as a separate question. We look at it as one question where different power dynamics are at play, and those different power dynamics lead to influence the process of class formation and the changes in the social structure itself. So that's the other issue I want to raise. The perhaps, how much time do I have? Maybe 2 minutes, 5 minutes? 2 minutes, okay.
2 more minutes.
2 more minutes. So maybe I'll just telegraphically pose a couple of other questions that arise out of the trilogy and out of also the rethinking volume, but maybe something that our network also needs to work on in a more focused manner. The one is, which actually Paris did quite well, Paris and Sam did quite well in the trilogies also, the question of if the reality, the social reality is to be conceptualized in terms of some of the questions that I have raised. It will, first of all, it will sort of raise a couple of issues about what kind of resistance we want. If such fundamental changes are taking place, then what is the resistance? And actually, I agree with the fact that defense of land is actually a key point of resistance. But the alliance between the peasant and the worker is something, and the worker in all its segments. Women workers, tribal workers, Black peasants, indigenous workers, the workers, it's all in segments. That means that our resistance will have to resolve the contradictions within the working classes itself. That means that our resistance and our resistance strategy will have to resolve the contradictions between the working classes itself, within the working classes itself, in order to forge a solid unity against this fascistic agrarian, fascistic capitalism that is now basically directly through its corporations raising the bar of accumulation to even air, for example, in the climate crisis, as Walter had mentioned. So these are some of the issues that I wanted to raise. And I think I'll just stop there. Thank you very much for this.
Thank you, Professor Prasad. I was really struggling to step in and stop you because you were so engaging in the questions that you are raising in response to the talk that Walter just gave, and precisely where you ended around looking at the social reality and the kinds of questions that we may want to grapple with conceptually, and also the sites of resistance that we may want to be engaging with. And you've left us with 2 points around engaging on defense of land as an important site that we mustn't lose sight of in the struggles for agrarian reform, but also what you said about the alliance between the peasants and the workers, and what raises in terms of the contradictions and the contradiction alliances that we may find within the working class itself. I think these are pertinent questions for agrarian reform. I would throw in there that we also have to think about the type of production that we want to see within the agrarian question. What I was saying earlier about the tension in ideological directions of resolving the twin problem of poverty and hunger, and this contestation between the Green Revolution and what we're seeing emerge as agroecology or food sovereignty and responses and systems that are driven by the farmers themselves. Where and how do we position them in this debate? And you also said something that is quite important, that the gender aspects should not be seen separate from questions of agrarian reform within our context. They are an integral part of how we resolve both historical questions and we begin to reshape and think the future. There's a number of questions on the chat function that are coming up, but before I introduce those questions that have come up, is we have here one more speaker that I've been asked to introduce, and this is I just want to make sure that I get the name right, but this is Professor Sitsu, who has been asked to jump in on the panel and provide a response as well to both issues that you've raised and that Dr. Chambati has raised. Professor Sitsu is Associate Professor at the Institute of Rural Construction of China, Southwest University, and founder of the Global University for Sustainability. Prof. Sitsu, I will give you an opportunity to speak, but I'm also going to ask you to be brief. If you could please just not take more than 5 minutes so that I can open up and give an opportunity to other panelists to make their inputs and ask questions. Prof. Sitsu.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Walter, presentation. And I have questions. In terms of Pan-African movement, how the relate to the any example of cooperation between the African countries? Because for example, in Latin America, in Venezuela, when the Chavez has took power, he also tried to develop some cooperative project with Cuba. So he exchanged the oil for the medical service from Cuba. So I wonder if any some kinds of cooperation between the African countries, particularly during cooperative food project or exchange. Yeah, thank you.
The network was a bit, wasn't very good, so I might have missed parts of your question, and I'm going to ask that you type it into the chat so that our panelists are able to respond to it. And meanwhile, before I go back to the panelists, I just want to read some of the questions that have been and comments that have come through here. The one is a question and a comment from Joshua Nyoni, and he says, given the need to respond beyond the agrarian system's challenges in Africa, mostly neoliberal programs, what intellectual and practical capacity can we lend to foresight capacity for innovation and knowledge as we move to the future of agri-food systems? So what intellectual and practical capacity can we lend to the foresight thinking? What are those issues that we have to take into account as we move forward? The other question that has come up, or is it a comment, is from Nancy Kachingwe. And she says, thank you so much, Walter, for your excellent and comprehensive keynote. I'd like to suggest that within the agrarian reform, we move beyond the language of including women. since women or women's labor are already indispensable to the food systems. And I think this quite aligns with what Prof. Prasad was saying as well. Inclusion suggests that women are outside the food systems, and when in fact the question is the terms of that inclusion, i.e. through capturing women's unpaid labor, frequently through violent means. Accumulation can't happen without women or households' unpaid reproductive labor to secure household well-being. Perhaps we should stop saying inclusion when we really mean exploitation. And and she goes on and then says, in other words, what needs to be included is the exploitation of women's unpaid labor as part of the system of patriarchal and capitalist accumulation. I'm going to pause here and let the panelists respond to some of the comments, insights, and questions that came through, and then I will go to the next round of questions. Walter, would you like to go first, and then Professor Prasad?
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair. There's a whole range of canvas of comments and questions raised by Achada. I would hesitate to engage with them, all of them at this particular juncture. I'll pick on some of the issues that she raised and respond to some of the questions that she raised. But I'll start with Nancy. If you notice, I used the term gender equity, which presupposes that women are already part of the system. But what we are wanting to advance is the issue of gender equity in the labor process, in the sharing of rewards that arise from small-scale production. It's not an inclusion as if they're outside. I recognize the importance of women, both as producers and also as unpaid labor in the domestic sphere to support the whole system of small-scale agriculture. So gender equity is the key terminology that I use. It already assumes women are part and parcel of the system, but under unequal terms with men in the control of resources, in the sharing of the resources that emerge from their engagement in both agriculture and non-agricultural sectors. Yeah. I got a glimpse of the question from Professor Sid Sui because of the internal challenges. Pan-African cooperation of the type that we witness in Latin America of Cuba, I think those are few and far between on the continent. We don't have such type of cooperation that I can think of at this particular juncture. But if you look at the example of trade, most of the trade that African countries have is with the outside world rather than intra-African trade. There's been a concerted effort to try to build regional trade and so forth. But most of the trade at this particular juncture is with the outside world. South Africa is the conduit for the penetration of goods coming from outside to penetrate to the north. Yeah. Then the other issue I would address, the third question I would address at this moment relates to the financialization of agriculture, the different ways in which capital is penetrating the countryside. Yeah, there are variety of ways which I didn't get a chance to speak about because of the limited time. One, of course, relates to the issue of land grabs through dispossession of land, but also another phenomenon which has been gaining ground over the last 20 or so years relates to the issue of contract farming, large monopolies promoting contract farming of different types of products, but largely focused on export crops such as tobacco and so forth. Few food crops are integrated within the contract farming value chains. So what we've seen from our research with regards to contract farming relates to the unequal the unequal power relations, China correctly mentions that although they don't directly control the means of the production, but they've taken over the labor process of how the product is produced. More or less, increasingly, the peasants are losing sovereignty and autonomy over how they practice small-scale agriculture. But there's so much monitoring and control and so forth, all these nitty-gritties, to focus production on the crop that is being funded by the different monopoly companies. So that, in a sense, has affected the gender relations in a sense that there's much more pressure for women to work to meet the demands of the different kind of contract farming. But the risk is more or less, the risk of failure of production is more or less borne by the peasants themselves. And one other key thing which we notice with regards to contract farming is it is reinforcing the differentiation, the inequalities within the countryside, because of the type of enrollment programs that these programs entail. Mostly targets small-scale farmers, mostly what you could consider as rich peasants who already have some form of equipment and so forth, background of resources. So it's reinforcing the differentiation that we see in the countryside as it targets, and women are falling far much further back because they don't have these types of resources to qualify to enroll. So that they come with a load of all things, insurance companies, contract farming is also a conduit for insurance companies to penetrate the countryside and extract surpluses. Because when farmers enroll on such type of programs, they are forced to sometimes to take up insurance for crop failure and so forth. So contract farming comes along with a whole range of other, facilitates the penetration of other different types of capital beyond just agrarian capital, to include insurance, banking, and so forth. I'll stop there at this point, Madam Chair. Our time is running out fast.
Yes, it is. I'm looking at my clock, and we don't have much time left, and the debate is only just getting heated up. I'm just going to read a few more questions, not the comments, just the questions, so that in your responses as we're wrapping up, you can think about how to respond to that. One of the questions comes from, it says here, how do we enter or create markets to agroecology in Africa? And it gives examples that in Brazil, there is family farming like MST and a lot of traditional communities. And they look to agroecology as a way forward. So in the context of our continent, how do we enter and create markets for agroecology in Africa? And then the next question is, how can we solve the problem of ecological and die of agricultural production? And what solutions are available for ethnic groups over control of land? I guess this is where ethnic groups don't have access to land. What is the solution around that? We've already read Nancy's question. The last question from Sudeep says that, okay, I'll read all of this. Thanks to all the presenters for your thought-provoking ideas. Hearing Professor Chambati, it seems to me that contemporary land and agrarian questions in Africa are similar to those of Nepal, but solving it from above as a policy question. Can it be solved through the programs such as land bank policy? The so-called parliamentary left government of Nepal, who is shy to utter land program in such a COVID circumstances where land and agriculture has become so important. So do we resolve the agrarian question from above? And does this mean a focus in policies such as the land bank policy is the question. And not all questions necessarily should be answered by Walter. We can also open up for our main discussants to chip in as well. Walter, would you like to go first?
Yeah, I thought you were going to give the platform to Achana. Okay.
I think she's on mute. I was hoping she would jump in.
Okay, no, thank you, Madam Chair. Yeah, so the issue around marginalization of ethnic groups in land access, I guess the obvious solution is we need land redistribution to accommodate various marginalized groups to also be part and parcel of an equitable distribution of secure land for them to reproduce themselves and their families. I don't see any other way beyond redistributing from the haves to the have-nots to accommodate other rural groups which are marginalized in owning and controlling land. Then with regards to how to resolve whether from above or from below, I think the forces from below have to put pressure. Forces from below movements, the examples I gave, will put pressure to bear on the state to introduce reforms, because most of our states are in alliance with agrarian capital. If left to them, transformation is going to be very slow, and it's going to be a long road for transformation to come. So I think the critical component that needs to play a major role in driving transformation forward are forces from below. If you look at the successful cases of Mali that have been talking, which have put pressure even to inculcate issues of food sovereignty into the national constitution, I think forces from below movements and different actors are key in that particular respect. Then agroecology markets, these are slowly evolving in Africa, but there's differentiation to the extent at which these have advanced across the different regions. More advanced in West Africa, and much slower, disparate groups here and there trying to promote the shift from high input agriculture towards agroecology. So these are slowly evolving, but not as much as would hope for in order to reverse the ecological damage that has been caused by high input and large scale agriculture.
Sorry, I was talking with Michael mute. Professor Prasad, could I ask you to also chip in and take some of the questions?
See, I couldn't hear properly because I went offline in the middle. So I think you just carry on. I will chip in later.
Okay, no problem. So Sue had been promoted to a panelist. I wonder if she might have some comments or responses that she wants to throw in, just based on some of the questions that were shared by colleagues. And in the meantime, Professor Prasad, just go through questions that are on the chat. Sitsu, would you like to come in? Or we can move on to the last round of questions.
Yes, actually, I also have one question about the financialization. Yeah, because when we remember the last financial crisis, it happened in 2008, and then at that time, many hot money went into the food market. So it's caused the food crisis. So I wonder whether this will have the second rate of the grand financialization. And so in that sense, so how the African countries to resist this kind of financialization? For example, if you have this kind of food production, even you purchase it or you exchange within each other, and then you don't use the US dollar or euro. So because nowadays we have this debate within China and discuss about the de-dollarization. That means how can we avoid to use the US dollar? But in Africa, maybe you have to use the euro. So I wonder if you have this, projects or debate or discussion about de-financialization or de-dollarization, de-euroization, and then use your own currency to deal with the food purchase within African countries. How to pursue this kind of social cooperation in terms of using your currency and also to be involved in food production. Yeah, this is my second question. Thank you.
Okay. All right. Thank you for that question. And the one last question that I'd like the panelists to also respond to is a question that is on the chat there. And the question is directed to Walter: how to understand land and labor processes in terms of ethnic groups in Southern African countries. And can you give some idea about the land classification in ownership and operational by ethnic groups in rural areas? And then the last question is: how can save the small and poor peasants in dry farming areas from fluctuations of markets? How do we protect peasant farmers, particularly in dry areas, from the impacts of market fluctuations? Prasad, shall we start with you, and then we have the last word from Walter, and I can wrap up.
Sure. So I'll only make two comments. One question about agroecology. I feel that the agroecological system can be an alternative, but I think the jury is still out on what institutional form it will take, because if agroecology increases the burden of the workers, then how do we redistribute that burden? I think the redistribution is not only of land or resources, but the redistribution also has to be of the care work, the unpaid work, and all the things that go along with that in agrarian systems, including in natural resource use systems. So this is an issue I would like to flag, and I would like to submit that the only way of achieving that equity is to have a step towards the socialization of care work and social reproduction itself. What you right now have is a privatization of social reproduction that is taking place. Private land holdings, private this, private that, and everybody fends for themselves. But meeting one's needs also has to be a collective process, and therefore I would like to visualize the sustainable, socially egalitarian system as one where the redistribution of resources, access, assets, means of production goes along with the redistribution of the burden also. So I think actually I've made both my points in this remark. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Prasad. Walter, your last words.
Well, thank you, Chair. I'll try to address the question related to any discourse around de-dollarization in Africa. I think at this stage on the continent, we have not yet got to that particular stage of discussing issues related to how to regain our autonomy in terms of the currency of transactions and so forth. Largely because most of our trade at this moment is largely with the external world. Yeah, food. Most of the food is coming from outside Africa. There's much less intra-African trade, but also because of the poor infrastructure of movement of goods from point A to point B across the country. If you look at our example here in Southern Africa, when we are faced with a calamity, it's much cheaper to move grain from Argentina than to move, say, from East or Central Africa because of the poor infrastructure and the cost, which imposes a high cost on the movement of goods and services across the country. I think we have to rebuild our capacities to satisfy at least the whole market before we start discussing. Then we can move on to discussing how to enhance the kind of barter kind of trade solidarity across. At the moment, we're still deficient even in fulfilling our demands for the whole market. So that's a major priority at this current juncture, to rebuild capacities of the peasantry to satisfy demand for the whole market, grain and other key commodities that we need for the survival of the many people who in the countryside. I'll stop there, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Thank you, Walter. And thank you, Professor Prasad as well. You both gave us some real food for thought, and we couldn't have exhausted such a complex topic that we also feel passionate about, but it's also a necessity just looking at where we are at the moment. I like that you at the beginning, and the reason for having this series and today's topic was just really to unpack the issues, because again, we go back to the extent to which COVID-19, the pandemic, has just magnified and protracted the agrarian crisis. It actually reminded us that with all the reforms that we have seen in the last couple of decades, we haven't really gotten to the crux of addressing the drivers of insecurity, food insecurity, the drivers of hunger and the drivers of poverty, particularly in our rural areas. And in your talk, Walter, you also took us through a journey through which we see the entrenchment and the penetration of foreign capital into rural areas. And you make an important point about the extent to which this is state-sponsored in how we're seeing foreign direct investment being courted within the agricultural space. But you also began to give us examples of what was happening in Zimbabwe around contract farming, and reminding us not to lose sight that this is not just about how capital makes inroads into the rural areas, but with contract farming comes many other things. We get to see crop insurance. We're seeing small scale farmers being largely indebted, but we're also seeing farmers lose their freedoms and rights around seeds and inputs, because with contract farming also comes a particular kind of seed that comes into that space. You reminded us that the drive that we're seeing towards that penetration of capital is not necessarily for meeting our needs in terms of food security, but it's to provide the supply for commodities that are needed in the international space. The moment that we're seeing now, you both spoke about the re-peasantisation, but even within that, we have to ask, Joshua asked a very pertinent question of what do we need to think about when we then begin to think about how to build the capacity of the peasant farmer to one, feed themselves, but also to respond to the very powerful forces that are at play in changing both the political and the social landscape in our rural areas. lots of questions on the gender dimension, and I'm glad that those questions come up, because the next seminar, the next topic in our seminar series is just going to be focused on that. It's going to be on COVID and gender perspectives, which will be led by our sister, Professor Georgie Tsikata, who is the director of the Institute of African Studies at the University of Ghana. On the 9th of September, we'll get to dig a little bit deeper on the gender dimensions that we started, and the gender relations and gender dimensions that we started to unpack today. And before I go on to thank the organizers and name them, I just wanted to remind you again that the book, which was launched at the beginning of our discussion, Rethinking Social Sciences with Professor Sam Moyo, is available, and people can purchase it from, it's distributed by the Columbia University Press. And should you wish to purchase a copy online, you will be able to get a discount, a 20% discount if you type in CUP20. And that makes that copy affordable, considering it's also priced in US dollars. So that 20% discount goes a long way in us making sure that more people have got copies of the, have got access, and they're able to afford the copies. I would like to thank the supporting partners. At the beginning, I mentioned the core partners behind the seminar series, but they're not working alone. They are supported by the Center for Informal Sector and Labor Studies at JNU in India, the Institute of Agrarian Studies at the University of Ghana, Global University for Sustainability, Hong Kong, China, and the postgraduate program in World Political Economy and Educational Technologies and Languages Unit at the Federal University of ABC in Brazil. And to thank people who've been working behind the scenes to make this series and today's discussion a success. I'd like to thank Joseph Matai, I hope I pronounced that right, Freedom Mazui, Nabajit Malaka, Isha Chowdhury, Rajiv Grover, Lalit Dabral, Priyanka, and Susan, as well as Julio. Thank you, colleagues, for doing such a great job behind the scenes and making it possible for us to have this dialogue on this important topic of agrarian reform in Africa. And thank you, Walter, our keynote speaker, and to all the panelists for a great job today. See you in September. Thank you.